Hello everybody, I am talking today to Simon van Schalkwyk, a poet whose second collection, Zero Summer, recently emerged and comes about 5 years after his first collection, Transcontinental Delay. I think both important works. Now I'm going to ask Simon to read from this collection a poem called Psychogeography, partly because the idea of psychogeography I think has a lot of resonance for his work, particularly in this volume.
I walked through the cities of Paris and Lisbon, nostalgic for the catastrophe of home. I gazed at monuments thinking, somewhere in Africa there must be a hole gouged from the earth, the same dimensions as Les Colonnes de la Barrière du Trône, vast terraces leading to subterranean jardins botanicos, with their own inverted monumental trees. And I remember one evening in Paris sitting outside, late at night, sort of early morning, 2 o'clock, and the entire city was lit up. Mm. And you come from South Africa where it's like, this is not possible. It was just post, rolling blackouts. Mm. And you think like, how is this sustainable? I think. So I think that is really the impulse that was driving the poem like that, and that line, the catastrophe of home, which I don't think is necessarily a pessimistic line, because I don't think Paris is going to be able to keep that up.
No, it's also going to be a catastrophe eventually.
Exactly, right. So in some sense, I think of South Africa as the future that Europe is going to arrive at some point. And I think of the periphery, if you want to use a kind of like theoretical term, has always been a space where some kind of future is already present at home. You are living in the future of the world. And these other spaces, which seem to be what we might think of as being admirable, desirable, and normal, are really just unsustainable spaces in lots of ways. And they better sort themselves out quickly before you enter the kind of future that you find in the periphery. Or maybe that's a good thing. Get to that future as quickly as possible so that we can figure something else out. Is really what was behind that idea. I think for me, there's no real clear method. I walked through the cities of Paris and London and Lisbon, nostalgic for the catastrophe of home. I think the second line came first.
Okay.
That idea of being nostalgic for the catastrophe of home came first, and then you just sort of, it mulls around, in your head for a long time, in my head for a long time. And then I write quite quickly, and I write on my phone. I sort of jot something down on a notepad, and I play around with it if I've got time, and I go back to it, and I play around with it some more, and then I sit down and write it down. And when I do that, I usually sort of think more carefully about what kind of drama I would want this small poem to have. So it's an interesting piece for me to just look at and to sort of think about critically. I mean, I understand people read it and they'll get different things from it. Sure. But for me, it's like there's clearly sort of like a first part and a second part to the poem. The first part goes all the way up to walking around the city and then wandering and trying to sort of identify that experience, that feeling of being alienated, looking at people sitting and being comfortable and being wealthy and being happy and glowing with the glow of the skin of wealthy people.
In the first world.
In the first world.
Yes.
And then wondering what it would be like for me to be like that, as comfortable as that. And I think there's something unimaginable about that for me. I don't know if I'd ever get to the point where I'd be able to sort of just be unselfconsciously in my body without thinking that, well, why do I have this, or why do I not have this? So that's always there. The second part is then shifting. You gaze at the monuments and you think about something else. And I think the thought is an historical thought, and it's a colonial thought. Seeing Africa, in this poem it's Africa, as the kind of hollowed out inversion that has given rise to the monuments of Paris. The place we were staying in had this enormous, just gigantic statue in the middle of a huge 5-lane concourse You know, so I mean, like just enormous. And I think that was, I call it monumental trees in this poem, but it was actually that I was thinking about, thinking that this thing that sort of, peaks upward phallically to the sky has been taken out of the ground of Africa and inverted and put over there, such that you've got this kind of like African thing, the material of colonial extraction, that is vertically sort of like propping that up, but leaving Africa full of these sort of like deep penetrative holes of extraction. That's really sort of the idea I was working
In a way, it's quite a concrete metaphor in
Yeah.
a way, because I mean, South Africa's built on gold mining.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, that's the coal that was gouged,
Gouged out of the ground.
and most of that money went to Europe,
Yeah,
and I suppose, and to the US.
yeah, and things are built out of
On
those.
that-
You know,
on
so the
that
entire
basis,
built
yeah.
environment. And, I think I am very much a sort of, I don't think of myself as a radically angry political thinker, but I don't think you can be South African and not write and think about a kind of colonial history. And for me, it's always the question of how do you present this in a way that is not obvious, not alienating to your reader, that will maybe puzzle your reader slightly, instead of sort of making a kind of statement. I'm very aware of South Africa's history of protest poetry, and I don't want to redo that again. But I do think that that element of protest is still in that particular poem, and in the poems of that sequence. In that sequence, the Portugal poems were in Lisbon, and I got a couple of found poems in the travel sequence, which is, I think, the third sequence in the book, where you can actually walk around Lisbon, a certain area of Lisbon. I can't remember exactly where it was, but you'll come across a statue of Adamastor, which is, the character from Camus's The Lusiads. But it's basically fenced off. And there's a little sign and placard that says, this is a lovely place for young people to sort of come and smoke weed and just watch the sunset under the shadow of Adamastor, this sort of like monstrous figure. And they treat it there as a kind of, one of Camus's great creations, but for us it's obviously the monster that, it wasn't a monster at all. Adamastor is Cape Town, it's the mountain.
No, Adamastor was supposed to be the giant who somehow
Giant who
gets
guards the place, the
turned
spirit of
into
place.
stone
Yeah,
as Table Mountain.
as Table Mountain.
That's Table Mountain is the remnants of Adamastor.
Exactly. So it's a spirit of place, and it's cast by Camus as something to be overcome in a kind of colonial way. So it has to be a monster. But if you come from the land of the monster, you don't think of the monster as a monster. So it's quite funny to go
It's
over
just your
there
mountain.
and see this terrifying idea of yourself reflected back at you as some kind of passive, fenced off, bolted off, tourist attraction in some way. So I think that's what I mean, just to come back to my first point, it's always trying to see in this other space what you find at home in a kind of inverted way. Right?
Right.
So Europe makes me think of the catastrophe of home, but in a kind of nostalgic way because of that. I look at Adamastor there and I kind of feel like he's been hard done by.
Yeah.
And I feel closer to Adamastor than if I were to hear someone from South Africa celebrate Adamastor as a kind of cultural trope that we can all get behind nationally. That doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense is that I see it from the perspective of the outside, and then I can have sympathy for it in some way.
Okay, when you talk about the sequence, you're talking about the poem is sectioned. I mean, the
Yes.
collection is sectioned,
That's right.
and each section is titled with a phrase from one of the poems in that section.
Yes.
And this particular one, you're talking about a sequence. Your sort of your title rubric for that section is like a cathedral sheltering the runaway.
Yes.
And cathedrals are very sort of Europe-y kind of things.
They are.
And that's the sequence that you say. It deals with sort of the Lisbon poems, you might say, and those poems that are I mean, is that sort of the outside of South Africa section? In a
Very
way?
much so, yeah. So the way it's sequenced is there's a first section, which is something I haven't done before, which are dramatic monologues. Set in what could be Johannesburg or Cape Town, but in the kind of like world of financial, technical, fintech. The speakers there are actually the same speaker. There are many different speakers, but they're all speaking the language of business.
Is it the capitalists?
Capitalists.
The oligarch.
Yeah, the oligarch sort of like voice. Right?
Yeah.
And that voice eventually breaks down and collapses at the end of that sequence. And it segues into the Johannesburg sequence, which is more a personal voice. And then the third sequence is, it's very similar to my initial collection. It's an escape sequence. You get outside of South Africa. And it's mixed in with poems that are descriptions of other places. So London, the cathedral sheltering the runaways, actually Lewis's station in Sussex, which actually has a kind of cathedral dome.
Right.
And the runaway is actually a little cafe underneath this dome. So if you're at the station, you'll see the runaway cafe there. But I like the ambiguity of it. The station is sheltering the runaway from South Africa.
Yeah.
It's the idea, basically. And in that section as well, I also have poems that are slightly different from the Johannesburg poems from section 2, which are more experimental poems, poems that I feel I can write without having to speak about place at all, I can write in the voice of John Ashbery or Frank O'Hara or whatever it might be, and those are kind of experimental. And the final sequence is a personal sequence, which is a history sequence, basically, a few poems about moving from, I don't know, age 20 till age 46, or whatever old I am right now. And tracking that. And I've put that right at the end because I don't actually like those poems very much. They're the personal poems that I think I would like to avoid.
So that's not the coda.
No, the coda is
that's that's the section each day sequesters carbon less and less.
That's right.
And these you're saying are these are personal poems. These are personal. Poems about personal history.
Personal history. They're far more personal than the poems in the Johannesburg section.
Right.
But I think what's tricky about the collection, I think what might be useful for a reader to know is that each subsequent section sort of modulates or brings into it something from the section prior. So, for example, the second section about Johannesburg will have inside those poems a kind of financial concern or anxiety.
Right.
And the Johannesburg
which
poems
links to the financiers
exactly
and the oligarchs
from
in
the
the
first
section.
one.
Yeah.
And the third section, which is the external poems, the foreign poems, will have the memory of the Johannesburg poems tracking through them, but also the memory of the financial poems tracking through them, such that when I get back to these poems that I think are poems about childhood or about family or about living in Cape Town or about coming to Johannesburg, much more personal, a voice that I think I try to write away from, but which I include because you have to have 50 or 60 poems now for a collection. That voice is then modulated by everything that has come before.
Right.
So even then it's not my personal voice, and I think that's really important because I don't want to write a personal poem that is authentically personal. I don't think I would be able to do that, like a personal confession. So the confession is now inflected by all of these other imaginative transports that I've attempted to sort of explore. And it gives you a better sense of it's almost as if I'm looking back at myself and writing about myself, but from the perspective of now,
Right.
rather than trying to inhabit what I was like at the time. But firstly, I like to pull in pieces instead of poems. I think of this short writing. You say poetry and you have this baggage of history that comes into the kind of writing that you want to do. So, I don't mind sort of saying that these are short pieces of writing that look very much like poetry, so you might as well call them that. But I am quite aware of sort of saying that if you present these things as poems, or you present yourself as a poet, then you're just bringing that baggage to bear on you. And I'm just I don't want the baggage, right? Let's just, let's judge whether the writing is interesting enough. I wouldn't even say good, I would say, is it interesting? And then to go back to the idea of form, I mean, I think there's different ways to think about form, right? So you can think about form as a kind of technical proficiency. And I think a lot of people frequently misunderstand form as simply being technically proficient in terms of the prosody. You know, does it have, you know, X number of syllables
Can you write
per
a
line?
sonnet?
Can you write a sonnet?
iambic pentameter?
Yeah, does this rhyme, you know, that kind of thing. I think of that more as technical stuff. I don't think of it actually as form. So the reason I think this is there was something that John Berryman said that I've always stayed with. And he said that when he was teaching one of his classes, he said that what's really important for him is the question of diction, poetic diction. What he meant by that is diction is usually the way in which one says things that's appropriate to the context in which it is said. That was his understanding of what he meant by diction. So you could
kind
get
of register,
like a
is
register,
involved
or
in that idea.
yeah, or the way in which a drunkard might put sentences together, or
Right.
words together. And I kept thinking about that, or a lawyer who'd speak with a particular kind of diction, right? A particular tone, a particular lexicon. I think that's what Berryman meant by this. And I thought that what I found interesting about that was because I was reading his dream songs, and obviously in the dream songs, you've got somebody who is completely incompetent in the situations that he finds himself in, and also has an external voice and an internal voice, and they never match up. He behaves or speaks appropriately according to the context, perfect diction, but his internal monologue is completely wrong for that particular context. And that is the difference between those two things that Berryman shows you, is internal and external world, is where the comedy and the tragedy of the dream songs comes from for me. And I think that idea is really, I try to play with, you know, if I'm conscious enough about my writing. I sort of say, what is the context that this particular speaker is in, and how do I make the voice of that speaker resonate or refract or karam off that context in a way that is interesting, right? So, for example, if I were to write a protest poem, for me it would be really funny to have a protester, you know, not in the context in which protest is usually presented on television or in the media, right, in front of Luthuli House or in the streets, but to have it sort of happen in like something like the Woolworths. You know, that for me would be interesting. The content of the protest is the same, but the space in which the protest happens changes. And I think that's very much what I was thinking about in the first section of this collection. What happens if you have CEOs talking in ways that are slightly close to the kind of voice of a CEO, business language or fintech talk, whatever, but presented in such a way that it sounds as absurd as I think it is. Right? So someone would be sort of saying, we have to look into all sorts of alternative materials. Honeycomb is a new material for building. The other one was, what is the line that goes something like, something honeycomb and bone. Right? So you add bone into that lexicon, into that diction, and it immediately should stop the reader and say, this is not what a fintech specialist should be saying. And for me, that's where the form comes from. Form is for me a kind of dramatic interplay between voice and space in some way. Yeah. Start thinking about it. If I think, oh, let me try to imagine what it was like for me back in Paris, right? I have a mental image of it, right? It doesn't come to me in words, but I think what comes to me first is an image of a space, and then what comes to me next is a kind of sense of mood, but it's a doubled mood. What I felt then and how I feel about it, thinking about it, right? So there's the picture is now invested with two kinds of affect. The attempt to remember the affect of being there and the attempt to reflect on that affect is also there. And then I think the next thing that comes is just thinking about, you know, a kind of weird internal monologue would develop about that.
Right.
And from that internal monologue there'd be a snatch of a sentence or a line or a word that I just cannot get rid of. And I keep going back to that snatch.
And it hooks you.
And hooks me. Like there's a poem called Solastalgia. I think this is a good one because it starts with quite a strange line. It says, "All turns steadily unmemorable." And I remember exactly where I was when I thought that. You know, sitting outside, it was dusk, and I was watching bats flying around. And I just had, it just pops into your head, right? You know, all turns steadily unmemorable. And then you kind of go, all turns steadily unmemorable. And it's a perfect line there.
You count the syllables.
I do count the syllables.
I think there might be a kind of sort of dichotomous division amongst all poets. The ones who count the syllables and the ones who don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I quite like. You know, I think there's a line that John Ashbery sort of says in, where does he say it? It's his collection of essays where he says something like, most beautiful things are reckless. And I do like that about poetry. You know, so there is form and structure and stricture, and there are these sort of senses of, you know, the history, the grand history of great poets who've written incredibly philosophical, affecting things. But there's also that Ashbery line, which is like just reckless. You know, I think that is at heart what the kind of spirit or gesture or feeling that I don't think I've managed to capture quite here, but it's certainly the impulse that drives when I write, and especially when I write poetry. Yeah.
Simon, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I walked through the cities of Paris and Lisbon, nostalgic for the catastrophe of home. What would it be like to seem as comfortable in my own skin as a café at Parigot or Alphacinia? I gazed at monuments thinking, somewhere in Africa there must be a hole gouged from the earth, the same dimensions as Les Colonnes de la Barrière du Trône, vast terraces leading to subterranean jardins botanicos, with their own inverted monumental trees.